And again, thanks again for having me. It's a very unique opportunity for me for a couple of reasons, because although your work is mainly based on birds that fly between Europe and Africa, I see a lot of parallels when it comes to Central Asian Flyway, in the sense that many species in the Central Asian Flyway also go to West Asian, East African Flyway, for example, such as sociable lapwing, where a population of the bird comes to northwestern India, but also goes to Sudan, for example. So I've always felt really fascinated by how birds make those decisions, and felt that there are many parallels between our work, also in terms of habitat. So India also has savannas, which are climatically analogous to the ones in Africa, although much more fragmented. And therefore, I think it's really interesting to compare and contrast these things between us. So thanks again for having me, and I hope we are able to discuss some very important themes in our academic research interests. So there are certain reasons why I chose to work with Central Asian Flyway, and it's located where the box is now. So there are about 8 different flyways that are globally acknowledged and established so far. And Central Asian Flyway is perhaps the shortest of them. So it does not go across different hemispheres or anything. So it's much shorter, but it's also unique in the sense that it's quite tough to travel in this flyway. The birds often have to cross over the highest peaks in the world, and species like barred goose even frequently cross over the Mount Everest, which is the highest peak, which even humans don't get to climb that easily. So these things really fascinated me, that the fact that birds make these really tedious journeys all the way from Palearctic to the Indian subcontinent. And that was one motivation for me to choose this area of interest. Secondly, my focus is mainly on grassland habitats. So I'll be mainly speaking about species that are grassland specialists, and the species that generally breed in Kazakhstan, where one of the remaining largest steppe grasslands are at the moment. And likewise in India, I will be talking about savanna grasslands in India, where many of these birds spend the wintering months. And both these ecosystems are very important because they have been major land use, land cover changes in them. So for example, in Kazakhstan, since the Soviet breakup, it has become a fire hotspot, which still continues to date. And with climate change, it's likely to have further fire activity in the region. And that has had an impact on birds, as we will see in a minute. Similarly, India has a vast or diverse ecosystems, but savannas or the grasslands are the least monitored, protected, or acknowledged ecosystems in India. This is likely because of the importance that is given at the moment for afforestation and reforestation projects to match the climate goals. And in general, I think all the charismatic fauna or high biodiversity areas in India are generally, they are looked on as a species of forests. So grasslands are often neglected, although they have a very unique biodiversity. And there is also long ongoing conversation about savannas in India, if they are true savannas in a way, which we will also talk about when we get to that part of the presentation. So Kazakh steppes are basically the breeding grounds for all these birds that are in the Palearctic. And then they come all the way down to India and stay there between about October and March. And this is what I basically focus on in my work. And both of these ends of the flyway are hotspot, are land use and land cover change hotspots. So in Kazakhstan, like I said, is the fire hotspot. And in India, there is right now large scale agricultural expansion and intensification that is going on. So both these ends have a lot of transformations going on. And that is the other reason why I think these areas are really important to study and understand. And then the final goal of my work would be to come up with some sort of biodiversity conservation recommendations or policy recommendations, which could identify these grasslands as some habitats which need protection, and their importance as they support a very unique kind of biodiversity. So that's what we will be mainly focusing on in this presentation. So we'll start with breeding grounds in the Central Asian Flyway, and more particularly in Kazakh steppe. And I'm going to focus on these 4 ecozones, the WWF-defined ecozones, that is meadow steppe, dry steppe, deserted steppe, and semi-desert. So we're basically looking at central, northern, and central western parts of Kazakhstan where many of these birds breed. And I will be mainly talking about post-Soviet breakup land use and land cover change in the country, because it was the single biggest factor that influenced land use and land cover in this area. And what does that mean? So on the right-hand side, you can see the land use as of 2010. I don't have an updated map right now, but it basically depicts the cropland extent and abandoned arable land extent. And by abandoned arable land, I mean land that was abandoned after the Soviet Union broke apart and people left their rural areas to go to the cities. And that had a very profound effect on these ecosystems. And you can see that on the left-hand side, where you can see the fire activity has been pretty high in these regions, which are abandoned in the central and western part of Kazakhstan. You will also see that there are lots of fires in the northern part, but if you notice, the burn scars have a different size. So in the central and western part of Kazakhstan, the fires have been more intense, much, much larger, and that can be attributed to the land use land cover change that took place after the Soviet Union broke off. Whereas the fires in the northern meadow steppe area, as we briefly saw, had some stubble burning and stubble fires, which were not as big. And they were perhaps part of a more natural fire regime that northern meadow steppe had. So this is a big difference between the meadow steppe in the north and the drier desertified steppe in the central and southern part of Kazakhstan. And this fire activity has persisted today and is likely to increase with climatic changes as well. So as you can see, it covers a really the largest steppe belt in Kazakhstan, in the central part of Kazakhstan, where the fire activity is quite high up until 2022 and ongoing. So what does this mean? What does fire activity or what does the fire legacy mean to Kazakh steppe? So I would like to start with the right-hand side of this slide, where we look at how the natural diversity used to look like in Kazakh steppe. Because fire and grazing has shaped the steppe ecosystem for a long, long time. So fires have not been unnatural elements of the ecosystem. There has always been fire events all across steppe, but the fire activity and the balance between fire and grazing has changed ever since the Soviet broke off. So on the right-hand side, you can see in panel A, you will see some fires in the abandoned land, which is at the moment grazed a bit by semi-wild horses. On the B panel, you will see moderately grazed steppe with slightly lower fire frequency. And with that, you will see a much richer structure in plant species on the panel B already. In the C, as you can see from the length of the grass, it's a heavily grazed steppe, and there's absence of grasses, mean there is low fuel load, there is low biomass, which means the fire probability here is low. In D, you will see there's steppe which is ungrazed for many years, and this fire line already shows you the difference in when the last fire took place in this region. And then E, you already see it's the same area, but again, a really high biofuel, bioload, biomass, which can trigger more fires. And the species are also then different here. The panel E is basically a habitat that is dominated by stipa grass, which is very fire tolerant. So the higher frequency does not matter here because the stipa will dominate where there is fire. And finally in F, you see a border of an unburned area in the right, which is not grassy, and burned semi-desert area on the left, which has burned more often than the one in the right. And fire in this case will consume the dense dwarf shrubs, which take much longer to establish than stipa grass. So this is basically the natural dynamics of fire regime in the steppe, which changed due to the workflow that I explained on the left-hand side. So immediately after the Soviet breakup, over the years, as land was abandoned, the livestock pressure declined. There was strong declines in grazing pressure and livestock quantities. And that meant that across the steppe, there was accumulation of biomass, and it created a feedback loop between stipa grass becoming more and more dominant because it was no longer grazed. It was getting burnt again, but it was again resprouting again. And this feedback loop basically brought about considerable changes in the natural vegetation, which is otherwise quite diverse, as we saw on the right-hand side. And these vegetation changes also meant that bird communities had to adapt. And this is what we will see next, that what happens when a diverse steppe ecosystem is transformed through some land use land cover change and now has a certain kind of grasses dominating the entire region. So based on this background, we came up with 3 research questions. The first one was, how does the changed fire disturbance regime, so this now newly dominant regime, will impact bird abundance and richness? Second, how will the bird response to fire disturbance vary across trophic gills? And third, how does the bird response to fire disturbance vary across grazing intensities? As we saw, there is a natural variation in grazing intensities, which is also changed. So the main challenge here was to quantify fire disturbance, because since 1990 up until 2009, when the first data were collected, as you can see in this graph, fires may have occurred in different time and different months. So what we did here was we created an 8-year period, which was based on the data availability on the satellites part. So I used MODIS fire data for this, and also when the data were collected. So I won't go too much into technicalities. We can discuss them later if you're a technical guy, or if you're interested in methods more in more detail, we can definitely discuss that. But we created this 8-year fire legacy period, which was adjusted with the year of the survey. So for each survey year from 2009 to 2017, we considered that 8-year window to be constant, which we shifted each year to make sure that each survey had the same fire legacy period considered to check or to test how fires might have impacted the habitat 8 years before we collected the data for that particular location. And based on these presets, we basically looked at fire extent, cumulative fire area, and fire frequency. And we basically, again, looked at grassland species, mainly looked at grassland species, the birds that would breed in grasslands. And on the bar plot on the left-hand side, you will also see what I mentioned slightly earlier, that meadow steppe has always had a considerable fire since the beginning because of the stubble burn. So this high fire activity here comes from the stubble burning. Whereas the other 3 habitats, you see the fires sort of get intense and they increase in numbers after 2000. So there was this about 10 years of biofuel accumulation period. That's what we think, when the fires sort of took their time, and then around 1998, 99, they started to really increase in these steppe grasslands, and then they lasted for about a decade. So if you come towards the latter half of last decade, you will see that the fires have again sort of receded a bit, and they're not as intense anymore. But again, we don't have the latest data yet, so we don't know how they are in many regions, but this decade or 15 years of period since 2000 has been a period of really high fire activity. So we tested this fire activity in the form of 3 fire variables, like I just mentioned. And then we basically had our first results. And it supported our assumptions regarding abundance and richness, as you can see, that the richness declined in ungrazed and moderately grazed steppe. And this is mainly because of the steppe domination. It removed the other niches, the other habitats, and the negative effect is especially visible in the steppe grasses for that reason, in the grazed or ungrazed. Similarly, abandoned fields, similarly, the semi-desert, for example, also had large fires, but here you see some positive effect. So as soon as you get out of steppe habitat, the dynamics changed again. And here we think that because semi-deserts were not burnt earlier so much, this new fire regime sort of created new habitats here, and that allowed some species to colonize these semi-desert regions. As you can see here in the ungrazed semi-desert, for richness at least, we see a significant effect. As you can see with abandoned land, we didn't find any significant effect. And here we believe that abandoned fields are quite dynamic habitats with different successional stages in close proximity. And because of high vegetation heterogeneity in abandoned land already, the effect of fire cannot be so linear. So we didn't find that effect in our work that abandoned land had, increase or decrease. Overall effect, as in overall riches or overall abundance was not noted in abandoned land. So it sort of supported our assumptions about abundance and richness on the overall level, but not across all habitats. So abandoned, arable, and semi-desert had a different story to tell. We also went across trophic gills and species-specific models. And here we saw that the negative effect was more pronounced for the species of the open ground, only barring skylark, species like skylark, because skylark are generally found in steppe grasses, naturally speaking. So barring that one species, we saw many other species that had a negative impact in abandoned land, also in formerly grazed steppe, but also ungrazed steppe. So overall effect of fire on many different species was negative. There were also some species-specific impacts. So black lark, for example, was a loser species in ungrazed steppe, and that's mainly because of its reliance on dung. It relies heavily on dung, and it requires dung for nest building, for example. So this is a species that is highly dependent on grazing, and that you saw in ungrazed steppe when the fires took over, it impacted black lark. Similarly, if you looked at shrub-dwelling species such as Siberian stonechat or booted warbler, you will also see that those were removed as fires started to dominate these grasses, and then these steppe regions, and then they lost their habitats, they lost their shrubs that they perch on, and then they were also removed from the ecosystem. In converse, pallid harrier was a winner in semi-desert, or winner species in semi-desert, and this we think is again due to the availability of new habitats or availability of more open ground potentially in biomass poor regions, and therefore it had better access to prey. So results definitely varied with trophic gills as we expected, and this also then satisfied our second expectation regarding biodiversity. So in summary, we realized that the novel fire disturbance definitely had considerable effects on bird communities, and there were more negative effects than positive. So there were more loser species than winner species. And there was variability across trophic gills, which was also seen. And regional land use patterns and livestock information will be key going forward, given the interdependence of fire and grazing. And we know now that currently wild horses are the main natural or semi-natural herbivores in the region, but still majority of the land is still abandoned, and grazing has, the livestock still has not recovered to the levels of 2000. So we really need to think about restoring these traditional free-ranging grazing systems. Here in the graph, which is already published work, you can see that in Kazakhstan, especially, there are sharp declines in sheep and cattle, which still have not recovered to the levels before 1990. So this crash of livestock still persists in many ways in Kazakhstan, and this means that as it slowly recovers, we need to think about restoration of the traditional free-ranging grazing system, and not too sedentary systems or too domesticated systems, which cannot spread the fire control through grazing across the steppe. And we also believe that climate change is likely to further increase fire activity. May not increase across the steppe, but it is going to increase overall fire activity in the steppe, because Kazakhstan is still a fire hotspot today. So yeah, in order to stop the strong ongoing declines in bird abundance and richness, or community assembly, these are some solutions, or these are some thought processes that we presented in our work. So this was the story about the breeding grounds, where we saw that fire regime took over, and that meant that certain species did benefit from it, but majority of the species had a negative impact on them. Next, we switch over to the the wintering grounds in the Central Asian Flyway. And that is basically the Indian subcontinent. And as you can see on the right-hand side, I have not included high altitude grasslands in the Himalayas or Northeast India. I'm mainly focusing on uh, grasslands of the central, like the Deccan Plateau, the central Indian peninsular Indian savannas, and also some deserts and semi-arid regions in the northwestern part of the country here, where the true deserts can be found. And with India, the thing is, grasslands are neither acknowledged nor monitored nor delineated. So there is not much information available regarding grasslands in India. And that has some colonial legacy. So during colonial times, grasslands were actually classified as wastelands because they did not have any monetary value, and the focus was almost entirely on woody vegetation, forests, and there were strategies that were drawn out to understand forest management and try to sort of focus on that. And the land that did not have trees or forests were deemed economically useless. So this category of wastelands was created at that time in mid to later half of 19th century. And unfortunately, that category still remains today. So the Indian government persisted with that category. We still have a wasteland atlas of India, which is updated every few years. And these areas are then used for all sorts of development projects or agricultural expansions. So many other activities are generally undertaken on these lands because forests are better protected and they have more charismatic fauna. So grasslands remain quite neglected in India. But do they have biodiversity? So the answer, the simple answer is yes, very likely. They have a lot of biodiversity. It's a very grassland specific biodiversity. But as you can see in the context of Central Asian Flyway, there are many species that come to India, and the graph on the left basically shows you, so these are basically species that breed in Kazakhstan. They come from Kazakhstan. And they start coming around October, November, and then they remain in India until February or March. And on the right-hand side, you can see their habitat, habitat usage. So these are data from my own fieldwork, and this was the initial visualization of where we found the species. So this is not anything analyzed, but just I wanted to see their distribution across different habitats. And I wanted to note here that there is, in terms of habitat suitability, you can see that it's not just grasslands that they are found in. There are many species that are definitely benefiting from cropland and mixed habitats. And by mixed here, I mean a mosaic of grasslands and savanna grasslands and agricultural landscapes. And as you can see, this is very likely due to the food availability that they have through these mosaics and through farmland and subsistence agriculture that India has. And therefore, you find them across different habitats. It's not that they are only found in remaining savanna patches or grasslands. So what does this mean? And here I wanted to briefly mention a couple of papers that sort of talk about what savannas mean in India. And I found this interesting because they compare Indian savannas to Africa, because they argue that climatically, Indian savannas are closest to African savannas. And they sort of try to convey the point that they were never wastelands. They were actually savannas, and eventually events like monsoon or climate was the reason why agropastoralism became dominant on these savannas. And they argue that therefore agricultural systems have always been part of these savannas, and they have supported biodiversity in the past. So if you look at the savanna probability map of India on the left, it comes from the same paper that I shared earlier. And I want to note here that this is just probability. So this is not the savanna extent, because obviously there is a lot of agriculture and a lot of fragmentation on these lands. But the larger point is that climatically speaking, the entire peninsular India is it has a probability of savanna being on it. So it's a very suitable climate for savanna to thrive on these peninsular Deccan Plateau region. And I also wanted to mention here that there is biodiversity evidence for this. So India does have species like wolves or hyenas, which are often found on grassland ecosystems. Similarly, we also, now as we will see, we get these grassland specialists from Central Asia that come down to India, meaning there is enough habitat for these species to exploit. So this sort of takes away this wasteland conceptualization to say that India has had grasslands in the past. They still have grasslands, and they have a function. So there is biodiversity that thrives in these grasslands. So what does it look like now, grasslands in India? So I just wanted to give you like a brief impression of it. So on the top left corner here, this is one of the very few protected areas, protected grassland areas. So as you can see, there are still many patches from the past which have been, which still exist. They're quite rare, but they're there. And here you can clearly see that this is not a degraded forest or anything. This has been a grassland. And of course, if you look at the other pictures, you will see that they have always been used. They have always been part of um, anthropogenic land use, not in a monoculture intensive way, but in some sort of mixed habitat way. So you already see on the bottom image that there's a variety of crops that are grown in the same region. And I also want to point out here that many of these regions, in fact, majority of these regions have subsistence agriculture. So we don't have monocultures or intensive farmlands that could compare to the farming practices in Europe or the US. So in terms of size of the crop field, it is still very small. In fact, it's getting smaller with farmland getting down to next generations. And so there is no corporate farming in the sense it is seen in Western Europe or the US. And similarly, pastoralism has also been part of Indian grasslands. And there were grasslands which were actually historically pastoral lands. They were kept aside for pastoral lands. And they were shared by the village, they were shared by the towns, and they were left aside, they were never cultivated. So those pastoral lands have been part of the ecosystem as well. And so the pastoralist communities are one of the biggest communities who are suffering right now because of grassland degradation or grassland shrinking of grasslands, because they don't have enough grass anymore to take their livestock to. So grasslands have had a very important role in human lives as well in India. And next, I wanted to briefly talk about how does agriculture grassland mosaic look like in India. So as you can see on the left-hand side, this is sort of western part of India, and Western Ghats are near the coasts here. And so the Western Ghats, or the Western range of mountains on this side of the land, plays a big role in how savannas are formed on the plateau region. So the mountain range on this side blocks all the water from monsoon, and the regions that are to the east of it become rain shadow regions. So savannas have developed in parallel with Western Ghats, which have always sort of kept these regions much drier. And there is lack of rain immediately when you cross over the mountains and come to the eastern side, or like the peninsular part of India, or towards the eastern part of India. And as you can see, there are different, these are two different land uses, but they're very mixed. So you will see grids with many grids with grassland probabilities, but in the same grid, you will also see cropland areas. And this is what I mean by agriculture grassland mosaics, that they are very much mixed with each other. And high fragmentation means that there are patches of grasslands mixed with patches of agriculture, which is generally very small. The main issue here then is not agriculture itself, but the way the land is cultivated. So traditionally speaking, India has had two main cultivation seasons. One is called Rabi season, that takes place between October and March. And then there is a Kharif season, which is the monsoon rain-fed agricultural season that takes place between June and September. So due to these crop rotation systems, India has always had landscapes which are very diverse. because there is no one crop that takes up the land use for longer periods of time. And that has always helped biodiversity to thrive because it creates these niches across the habitat where many species can benefit from it. And in this region, especially in my field sites, this is now challenged by sugarcane cultivation, which takes much longer to grow. It takes between 12 and 18 months to grow. And the demand for sugarcane is naturally increasing a lot for biofuel purposes or for sugar demands. And India is now the second largest sugarcane producer behind Brazil. So sugarcane production in this region, as you can see on the graphs on the right-hand side, has increased in the past two or so decades. And so has maize. So I'm not saying it's just sugarcane, but the larger point here is that certain traditional crops have declined in the past few decades, such as sorghum, millets, or other rabi pulses, at the cost of sugarcane taking over these areas. So there's definitely some sugarcane expansion in these regions. And from my conversations with the farmers there, it's also the case that the sugarcane yield is stagnating as a constant production of sugarcane might be impacting the soil quality and other, so they have to provide now a lot of fertilizers. It has to be irrigated all year long. And therefore, the only way to get more production now is to expand because the yields are stagnating and they need to produce more sugarcane. So this expansion or this increase in area of sugarcane is likely to continue in this region. And as you can see here, some of this is sugarcane, but there's also some traditional agriculture in there. So it's a mixed habitat again, like as I was saying. So based on this background for India, I had three research questions as well. First one was, how does agricultural intensification impact overall and migratory bird abundance and species richness? So again, I wanted to compare what happens to the same species in the Central Asian Flyway when they come to India. Then I also wanted to compare if the response varies with changing composition and configuration of land, agricultural grassland mosaics. And this I will get into detail in a minute, but this mainly talks about the land cover diversity and also field size of agriculture. And lastly, I wanted to see if migratory bird response varies between different trophic gills. So again, I wanted to compare and contrast how land use land cover change impacts bird abundance and richness. And in this context, more about the birds in the Central Asian Flyway, the grassland specialist birds. I will briefly go over my study design here. So in India, I chose the area of sugarcane. It's a sugarcane hotspot, for example. You can call it sugarcane hotspot. And we collected data across different gradients of land cover. So it wasn't just grassland or just mixed habitat, but we wanted to see how does it change across different habitats. So we had some grids with just grassland, some grids with no grassland, some grids closer to the water and things like that. So we tried to sample as much as we can to collect different kinds of land use land covers across this region. In contrast to Kazakhstan, fieldwork in India is a bit complicated because landscapes are not as vast as Kazakhstan. So the diversity is very high. So we didn't really have to go all over the country to sample diverse ecosystems, which may have been the case in Kazakhstan, where the state grassland just continues for hundreds of miles, which is not the case here. So this land is highly fragmented compared to Kazakhstan, which means within a small area of interest, you are able to collect a lot of diversity within land use as well. And my work in India was mainly focused on primary productivity in grassland agriculture mosaics. And this I based on integrated NDVI. Again, I don't want this to be very technical, so we can discuss the technical part later if you're interested. But to put it simply, what I did was I tried to accumulate NDVI values, so the proxy for primary productivity, to see if I can quantify sugarcane or the plants that are constantly productive in that sense will generally have a higher NDVI. And therefore, I chose one complete sugarcane cultivation cycle of about 18 months to see if I can sort of quantify sugarcane cultivation in the region and separate that with traditional seasonal cultivation to say that, okay, this habitat has agricultural intensification and this habitat still has seasonal cultivation, which means it's not so intense. And this then I was able to use in my landscape composition variables. And that leads us to my variables that I explained so far. So for landscape configuration, I mainly focused on individual field sizes, and there I basically used fields that intersected with my study site, and I chose the entire area of the field. So it made no sense to cut them according to the circle, but we wanted to see the real area of the field, and therefore the entire field was considered when it came to the mean field size or landscape configuration, for example. For landscape composition, on the other hand, we were more interested in the diversity of the habitats, what kind of what different land uses or land covers were present in that habitat. And also, like I mentioned earlier, we wanted to separate annual crops from semi-perennial crops. So we wanted to separate sugarcane from not sugarcane. And again, this is very specific to my region because my region has lots of sugarcane. This model will have to be adjusted for other parts of India where sugarcane may not be the intensive crop, but some other crop might be that intensive crop. But the idea here was to separate intensive agricultural practice from traditional agricultural practice, and then compare how that impacts bird response. And our results basically told us that it has very significant impact in many ways. So as we expected, if the land cover is more diverse, which means there is seasonal cultivation on it, it creates more niches, and that is reflected in the species richness, for example. So here you can see that for all the species that we collected, and there were about 144 species that we collected, the richness was higher in the landscapes where there were more habitats were available, creating more niches. Similarly, we also saw that areas with seasonal cultivation cover, so if within a study site, the seasonal cultivation proportions were higher, the bird abundance was also higher, which also supported our expectations that with diverse habitats, there is more food availability, and that might mean that there are more birds getting attracted to these areas. And finally, we also saw that mean cultivation area had a negative correlation with species richness. And this is again supporting our expectation, as we said that with larger areas, there is not enough diversity within habitat, and that can only support certain kind of species, but not the richness will not be high because only certain species will benefit from it, if at all. That being said, I don't think personally this mean cultivation area has to be considered carefully, because like I said, the field area in India is just not that high. The national average for India is 1 hectare compared to 500 or 5,000 hectares in the West. So I don't think that's the key here yet, as long as I know yet. But this is something I'm also trying to explore going forward, how the field area impacts. Maybe it does impact. I may be completely wrong, because maybe it creates some, maybe these micro habitats or micro niches are also important. So that's something that requires a bit more attention, in my opinion. Then we come down to migratory birds. And here I couldn't do species-specific analysis because the sample sizes were not that high. But we did see some trends here where we saw that in year-round cultivation, the carnivores have a negative impact because they need open grounds. So carnivores are carnivores species are one group of species which we think that they do need open grass and habitats to hunt. And therefore, in year-round vegetation, where there is lots of sugarcane, they are no longer able to hunt. Similarly, we saw that where there was woody vegetation cover, which accounts for semi-natural or afforestation projects sometimes on grasslands, it also has a negative impact on open ground species because they do require open ground to feed on, and that is no longer there, so they have a negative impact. And then we also saw that seasonal cultivation here again was beneficial even in migratory birds, as it potentially provided them with different kinds of food options. Especially I saw many shrub-dwelling species feeding on different kinds of grains and fruit, seasonal fruit species that are grown in my region. So this seasonal cultivation definitely benefited certain species. So what does this mean? So we think that this basically, again, just like Kazakhstan, this means that land use change will always have a mixed effect on birds. But even here we saw that the overall bird abundance is higher in seasonally cultivated fields. So this grazing fire thing was one important outcome for Kazakhstan. In India, it was the seasonal cultivation that was the focus here, which definitely had a very positive effect on the biodiversity. Again, the richness was also supported by this, so diverse habitats were able to host more species. And the larger field size, we suggest so far that larger field size does matter to species richness, at least, where you don't see that many species in larger fields. And the habitat specific, the response was habitat specific, especially for the Central Asian migrants that come to India. And in terms of future, there are certain things that we cannot ignore, that our agricultural expansion and intensification is likely to continue, and also understandable in some to some extent because of the population that India has and also demands for different food products. So just cutting off intensification is not an option and not the solution here. But we want to think about different land sharing approaches. So if there are regional species or migratory species that are able to adapt to certain kind of land use or land composition, that is something that we can adjust to, where a shared land could have grassland patches, seasonal agriculture, and also sugarcane in some areas, because like I said, completely removing sugarcane is not an option. But this is more about what would be the optimal way to share these agricultural grassland mosaics so that the biodiversity also benefits from it or is protected. And at the same time, communities that rely on these landscapes, mainly farming communities and pastoralists, they should also benefit from it. And as opposed to, a blanket afforestation or infrastructural projects. So that is the final message from this India part of the work. So I want to thank you all. I also wanted to reintroduce myself in a way that I come from University of Göttingen, from Department of Conservation Biology. I'm supervised by Dr. Johannes Kamp, who's the group leader of our group. And these are some other projects which are ongoing in our department. So if you want to connect with us, or if you have any questions, or if you have any ideas to share with our department, you're more than welcome to. And yeah, if you have any questions, I would gladly try to answer them to my best ability. So thanks a lot.
Bonjour à tous. Alors, aujourd'hui, nous avons eu une présentation sur les impacts des changements d'utilisation des sols sur les oiseaux migrateurs de la voie migratoire d'Asie centrale par Tejas Bhagwat de l'Université de Göttingen, où il fait son doctorat. Donc, la voie migratoire d'Asie centrale est une voie migratoire relativement courte comparée à d'autres qui fait le lien surtout entre les steppes d'Asie centrale, par exemple au Kazakhstan, et le subcontinent indien. C'est une zone qu'il est relativement difficile d'étudier. Il est difficile de se déplacer dans certains de ces pays. Donc, on a surtout parlé ici de changement d'utilisation des terres. La première partie de la présentation concernait les sites de nidification dans les steppes du Kazakhstan. Ces steppes sont divisées en différentes écozones selon leur niveau d'aridité. Et le focus était surtout sur les changements après la fin de l'ère soviétique, donc avec l'abandon des cultures et les déclins des activités pastorales. Il y a eu une recrudescence de l'importance des feux dans ces zones. Des recensements ont été conduits dans chacune des 4 écozones avec différents régimes de feux selon l'étendue et la fréquence de ces feux. On a vu que l'effet du feu dépend de l'habitat et que l'effet du feu est aussi différent selon les espèces d'oiseaux concernées ou les guildes. Par exemple, il y avait un effet négatif sur beaucoup d'espèces des milieux ouverts, comme l'alouette calandrelle, l'alouette leucoptère ou le traquet Isabelle, et différents effets selon donc, les guildes, plus d'effets généralement négatifs du feu que positifs. Une importance des patterns régionaux d'utilisation des sols et des informations sur le bétail seraient nécessaires. Et enfin, une des conclusions, c'était qu'il faudrait pouvoir restaurer et maintenir là où il existe encore le système pastoral traditionnel avec des troupeaux libres plutôt que la situation présente. Et donc, on a aussi vu que les changements climatiques pouvaient avoir des effets euh, aggravants sur ces changements. Ensuite, le focus s'est déplacé sur les zones d'hivernage de ces oiseaux, donc sur l'Inde. On a vu que les prairies étaient, surtout lors de l'ère coloniale, considérées comme inutiles et qu'elles n'ont pas fait la cible de mesures de conservation suffisantes, contrairement aux forêts. De nombreuses espèces hivernantes en Inde depuis l'Asie centrale utilisent pourtant ces habitats. Ils utilisent à la fois les zones de prairies, les zones d'herbage et aussi les zones cultivées. On a ensuite parlé beaucoup des savanes en Inde. En Inde, il y a donc beaucoup aussi d'agriculture et de fragmentation dans cet habitat. Ces savanes ont été utilisées depuis très longtemps par les activités humaines. Au sud de l'Inde, on a vu que les Western Ghats, qui est une chaîne de montagnes au sud-ouest de l'Inde, fait barrage pour les précipitations qui arrivent avec les moussons, que les régions à l'est sont essentiellement couvertes de savanes. C'est là que les études de Tejas ont été réalisées. On a vu qu'il y avait un changement dans certaines cultures, une diminution de la culture de sorgho et du millet, et en revanche une augmentation de la canne à sucre et du maïs avec des effets aussi sur la biodiversité. Et des effets de l'utilisation des sols sur les oiseaux ont été constatés. Donc, ils ont comparé selon les guildes, plus particulièrement sur les espèces migratrices, quels étaient les effets de l'utilisation des sols. Et on a parlé donc de saisonnalité, de productivité primaire et utiliser le NDVI pour quantifier la productivité l'utilisation des sols. Euh, donc, il y a une différence entre les cultures annuelles ou les cultures semi-pérennes. Et la conclusion donc de ces analyses était que la diversité du paysage est importante avec des structures qui permettent aux oiseaux de trouver de la nourriture, probablement aussi des endroits pour se réfugier, et que c'est aussi spécialement important pour les espèces migratrices qui viennent depuis l'Asie centrale. Et donc la conclusion par rapport à tout ça, surtout par rapport à l'Inde, c'était que l'intensification va probablement continuer à augmenter et qu'il est nécessaire d'avoir des stratégies de partage du territoire pour maintenir la diversité des oiseaux et promouvoir les populations locales dans un même temps. Alors, merci beaucoup, Tejas, pour cette très intéressante présentation. Thank you very much. I will
Thanks.
leave the questions now.